They whispered her name like a curse and worshipped her like a deity. In the golden halls of imperial splendor, she did not walk, she descended. Not as a queen, not as a woman, but as a living god. At least, that's what she believed. She demanded her court bow until their foreheads touched the stone. She ordered temples built in her image, prayers rewritten in her name. And when anyone questioned her divinity, she had them erased. The empire trembled under her reign. Palaces became prisons, whispers turned into screams, and blood ran cold through marble floors. To some, she was the divine mother of salvation. To others, she was pure, unrelenting madness in human form. This is not a tale of power gone too far. It's the story of what happens when power believes it is God. To understand how one woman transformed from empress to living deity and nearly dragged an empire into delusion with her, we must return to a throne veiled in incense, paranoia, and divine fury. The empire was ancient, older than memory, older than scripture. Its people spoke of a divine mandate, a celestial order where emperors ruled not by vote or sword, but by heaven's breath itself. It was said that the ruler sat not on a throne, but at the center of the universe. In this sacred order, women were meant to serve from the shadows, to give birth to sons, to whisper counsel, to grieve in silence, not to rule, and certainly not to declare themselves divine. But in the 8th century, during the twilight years of Japan's Nara period, one woman shattered that unspoken law. Her name was Fujiwara no Himikobut. The world would remember her by the name she claimed for herself. Empress Koken, and later Empress Shotokutwi's crowned, once feared and forever controversial. She was not born in chaos. She came from imperial silk and quiet privilege, the daughter of Emperor Shomu, who was a devout Buddhist and the first to build great temples across the land. Her mother, Empress Komyo, was the first common-born woman to marry into the imperial family. From birth, Koken was surrounded by incense, scrolls, and ritual. She learned the sutras as other girls learned embroidery. She recited Buddhist chants before she could fully write her name. And yether, education was not one of quiet devotion. It was an armor crafted for survival. The Nara court was a treacherous nest of ambitions. Aristocrats aligned with temples, generals allied with monks. Buddhism, which once preached release from desire, became a tool for grasping power. Temples amassed land, priests dined like princes, and behind folding screens, the lines between spiritual enlightenment and political conspiracy blurred. By the time Koken was named heir, the throne had already become a battlefield, not of armies, but of ideas. Was the emperor merely a man blessed by the heavens? Or was he something more, a living vessel of divine will? For Koken, the answer was never in doubt. Crowned at a young age, she ruled as empress for nearly a decade. But the title alone did not satisfy her. Even after abdicating to allow a male cousin to reign, she remained present, an invisible sovereign in the palace shadows. She listened, she studied, and she watched as the court tore itself apart with plots and backstabbing. Then, when her cousin the emperor fell ill, she returned not as an advisor, but as empress again. No woman had ever ruled twice. No woman had ever returned to power with such force. By now, her transformation had begun. She no longer spoke of merely serving Buddha. She spoke as Buddha. She claimed dreams, visions, revelations. She began to write decrees that blurred the line between scripture and imperial law. She believed that the gods did not whisper to her. They spoke through her. And at her side stood a man who would become both her prophet and her downfall, a low-born Buddhist monk named Dokyo. What followed was a reign of incense, fear, and holy fire. But to understand how an empress became a self-declared deity and nearly pulled the empire into a religious monarchy, we must follow the rise of this strange partnership. In Part 2, we step into the temple corridors and shadowy chambers of Nara, where ritual became politics and belief became a weapon sharpened for control. To rule in the Nara period was not merely to command. It was to balance two great and rival forces, the imperial court and the rising power of the Buddhist clergy. For centuries, emperors had used Buddhism as a symbol of moral virtue, erecting grand temples to display piety and stability. But somewhere along the way, the line between devotion and domination blurred. Temples no longer bowed to the throne, they bargained with it. Priests held land, wealth, and influence beyond imagining. Some monasteries commanded armies of warrior monks, capable of crushing entire districts, and the clergy had grown bold, declaring omens, interpreting natural disasters, and undermining imperial decisions in the name of divine will. This was the world that awaited Empress Kokon when she returned to power. But instead of suppressing the clergy, she embraced theme specially one. His name was Dokyo, a monk of humble origins, but extraordinary charisma. He had once healed her from an illness, or so the story goes. But whatever the truth, his influence quickly grew from that of healer to spiritual advisor, and then to lover, and finally, in the court's whispers, to co-ruler. It was a partnership that upended centuries of imperial tradition. Dokyo was gifted land, titles, the power to issue edicts, and control over religious appointments. He moved into the palace. He sat beside the Empress during rituals. He was even allowed to issue decrees in her name, speaking with what some claimed was divine authority. It wasn't long before Dokyo began to suggest that he too was touched by the gods. One prophecy, likely commissioned by his own followers, claimed that if Dokyo were made emperor, the realm would know eternal peace. The Empress didn't reject this prophecy. She welcomed it. She issued imperial orders, suggesting that Dokyo should be placed at the head of the government, not merely as a monk, but as the future of Japan itself. The court was horrified. This was more than a scandal. It was heresy. To crown a monk, a commoner, as emperor would collapse the centuries-old belief that only those of divine blood descendants of the sun goddess Amaterasu could rule. Behind closed doors, aristocrats plotted. The powerful Fujiwara clan, from which Kokon herself descended, considered her reign not divine but delusional. The Empress was no longer just bending tradition. She was rewriting it. She wore ceremonial robes reserved for gods. She ordered prayers where her own name replaced that of Buddha. And worst of all, she silenced dissent with terrifying efficiency. High-ranking officials who questioned Dokyo's influence vanished. Monks loyal to other temples were banished or executed. Even her own family grew afraid to speak in her presence, lest they be accused of blasphemy. The empire had become a shrine, and the throne a pulpit for madness. Yet not all believed it was madness. To her followers, Empress Shotoku was the embodiment of dharma and destiny. She gave land to temples. She eased tax burdens for clergy. She promised spiritual salvation. To the common folk who toiled in rice fields and feared the wrath of heaven, her reign brought hope, twisted as it was. But inside the court, fear reigned. The question was no longer, will she name Dokyo her successor? It was, will Japan ever be ruled by an emperor again? The divine mandate, once passed quietly through generations, now trembled on the lips of a woman who believed herself a god and a monk who intended to become one. In Part 3, we walk into the storm, the final years of her reign, the unraveling of her vision, and the moment Japan stood on the edge of a theocracy, a kingdom where gods ruled not from the heavens, but from the throne itself. The year was 764. The air in Heijokyo, the imperial capital, was thick with incense and tension. At the center of the golden hall stood Empress Shotoku, no longer cloaked in the modest silks of an earthly monarch. Her garments shimmered with gold-threaded lotus petals. On her brow rested a diadem fashioned not with the sun emblem of her ancestors, but with sacred Buddhist symbols. She no longer prayed to Buddha. She spoke as him. Court records from the time grow strangely silent here, as if the scribes feared to write what they saw. But oral accounts, monk scrolls, and bitter letters preserved in secret speak clearly. The Empress had descended into full-blown delusion, and her court was forced to bow along with her. Every morning, the court gathered not for governance, but for ritual. Sacred verses written by Shotoku herself were recited aloud. Temple drums echoed through marble corridors. Foreign envoys watched with confusion as diplomacy dissolved into religious theater. Dokyo, once a monk of modest ambition, now walked like a shadow of the Empress. He wore imperial purple, He issued decrees. He rode in palanquins reserved for the emperor alone. Some whispered that he had begun referring to himself not as regent or priest, but as the next rightful ruler of Japan. He even ordered the creation of a sacred sword, forged in the image of the legendary Kusanagi no Tsurugione of the three imperial regalia of Japan. This was not a partnership. It was a dual reign of delusion and control. And the empire? It bent under the weight of their fantasy. Peasants were taxed to fund temple expansion. Shrines were rededicated in the Empress's name. Government affairs stalled as officials were required to consult Dokyo's divine guidance before any decision. One courtier wrote in a now-lost diary, later quoted by historians, "The state no longer functions. We serve not a sovereign, but a god trapped in a woman's skin. She believes herself immortal, and I fear she may be right." But not all bent the knee. Outside the palace, opposition was brewing. The Fujiwara clan-ancient power brokers of the imperial line began to move against the Empress. They believed Dokyo was poisoning the throne, corrupting divine blood with manipulation and heresy. Secret meetings were held in countryside villas. Old generals sharpened forgotten swords. Even within the palace, some scribes began smuggling messages of warning to allied nobles. Then came the tipping point. In late 764, the Empress announced her intent to pass the throne not to a blood heir but to Dokyo. A monk, a commoner, a man without a drop of divine lineage. The court exploded in chaos. Some officials broke down in tears during the announcement. Others screamed accusations of blasphemy. Guards were placed outside palace doors, not to protect, but to monitor. The empire teetered on the edge of a spiritual coup. And then, fate intervened. The oracle of the Usa Hachiman Shrine, one of the most sacred voices in Japan, was consulted. Tradition dictated that Hachiman's will delivered through trance and ritual must be obeyed. The message returned was clear. No man not of imperial blood may ascend the throne. If Dokyo becomes emperor, chaos will follow. The Empress was devastated, but Dokyo, desperate, attempted to falsify a second prophecy. He bribed monks to produce a fabricated divine message, declaring his rule as destiny. The ruse failed. The Fujiwara clan pounced. They confronted the Empress with the false prophecy. The imperial court, pushed beyond its limit, rose in revolt not with swords, but with documents, tradition, and the quiet weight of national disgust. Dokyo was stripped of his titles and exiled to the distant province of Shimotsuke, forbidden from ever returning to political life. He died there in obscurity. Years later, his temples empty, his legacy erased from official records. And the Empress? She was allowed to keep her throne, but not her voice. Her decrees were rewritten by ministers. Her access to temples was restricted. She ruled in silence, a puppet monarch locked within the cage of her own broken vision. She died just 3 years later. No great mourning was declared, no golden statues erected. Only a quiet relief whispered through the halls of Heijokyo. But even after her death, the scars she left endured. The imperial court issued a strict decree. No woman would ever again hold the throne in her own name. And for nearly 1,000 years, that rule stood unbroken. Because Empress Shotoku had not merely broken tradition, she had convinced herself she was above it. And in doing so, she turned the divine right to rule into a spectacle of madness. When Empress Shotoku died in 770, there were no temple bells, no official proclamations of grief. Her passing was quiet, deliberate, almost erased, and that silence was intentional. The court, still reeling from the near collapse of its sacred order, moved quickly to seal her legacy behind ceremonial restraint. Her edicts were reviewed, her name slowly erased from key imperial documents, and her most controversial titles, those declaring her a living deity, were never spoken again. Even in death, she was considered dangerous. But while her name faded from public inscription, the impact of her reign cut deep. The first and most immediate consequence: a formal ban on female emperors. What had once been rare but accepted women ascending the chrysanthemum throne was now viewed as a threat to imperial stability. For over a millennium, no woman would rule Japan in her own right. That decision wasn't based on capacity or lineage, but fear. Fear that another empress might walk the same path. Fear that devotion might again turn into delusion. Shotoku had not just ruled, she had dared to fuse the sacred and the sovereign, to redefine divine right, not as something inherited, but as something claimed. It terrified those who believed power should remain predictable, inherited, controlled. But beyond court politics, her reign also transformed the relationship between religion and the state. Her abuse of Buddhist authority sparked a backlash. The once revered monks of major temples found themselves under suspicion. The government passed strict laws to limit the influence of clergy in political matters. Monasteries lost privileges. Monks were forbidden from owning arms, from meddling in governance, from living within the capital. Temples became temples again, not political fortresses. The balance between spiritual authority and state power, once tilting dangerously toward collapse, was forcibly corrected. And that correction shaped Japanese politics for centuries. But history is never one-sided. To some Buddhists, Shotoku was not a mad tyrant but a martyr, a ruler who tried to bring enlightenment into law, to blur the line between sacred truth and temporal power. Her decrees, her sutras, her temple grounds they lived on, and in some sects, she was quietly remembered as a patron saint of esoteric Buddhism. Even in exile, Dokyo was never formally condemned as a heretic. Some of his writings were preserved. Some of his reforms survived. The official record tried to bury her, but in whispers in poems, chants, and temple scrolls, she was never fully erased. Because even as she failed, Empress Shotoku had forced Japan to confront its contradictions. Could a mortal be divine? Could a woman be God? What happens when belief becomes law? These questions didn't vanish. They evolved, surfacing centuries later in political cults, imperial worship, and the rise of state Shinto during Japan's militarist era. Her story was a warning, but it was also a prophecy, a reminder that when power and faith intertwine too tightly, it's not just rulers who are changed, it's nations. In the quiet archives of Nara, behind walls of aged paper and worn stone, the name Empress Shotoku is rarely spoken aloud. To the official record, she was a ruler brief, eccentric, and ultimately irrelevant. But to those who read between the lines, she was something more, a mirror, a reflection of what happens when faith, fear, and power collide. When belief ceases to be personal and becomes policy. She ruled in an age when gods were everywhere, in the wind, the mountains, the temples, but none had ever worn the crown. Until here. And whether you call it madness or devotion, delusion or divinity, the truth is this: she believed. She believed she was chosen. She believed her rule was righteous. She believed her voice echoed not just in court but in heaven. And belief, when unchallenged, becomes dangerous. She wasn't the first ruler to cloak herself in divinity. History is littered with god-kings, divine emperors, messianic generals. From ancient Egypt to imperial Rome, from Chinese mandates of heaven to 20th century cult leaders, power loves the sacred. It silences critics. It justifies cruelty. It transforms policy into prophecy. But Japan remembered. The centuries that followed her reign would see great restraint placed on both women and priests. Divinity was no longer a claim, it became a carefully guarded myth, reserved only for the abstract figure of the emperor, never to be wielded directly again. Until modernity cracked open those myths once more. Until emperors were declared gods in wartime propaganda. Until blind obedience became national creed. And then, like before, belief came crashing down. Not with swords this time, but with bombs and treaties and silence. Empress Shotoku's fall was not the end of divine rule. It was just the first warning, a distant thunderclap echoing through time. Her story asks a question still relevant today. What happens when leaders believe they are more than human? When power convinces them they cannot fail, cannot err, cannot be questioned? It begins with temples, then titles, then silence. And it ends always with collapse. Her palace is dust now, her temples reclaimed by moss and shadow, but her story still lingers. In every ruler who wraps themselves in faith, in every law passed in the name of destiny, in every whisper that says, "I was chosen." History does not forget. It waits, and sometimes it repeats. This was the story of the mad Empress who believed she was a god. But more than that, it is the story of what happens when the divine forgets it is human.